Lancaster, as you may well know, some of you who are history buffs, was a wilderness place back about 1642. The pioneers came out here. They did not hope to establish a religious community necessarily. They were proprietors, and they were looking for iron ore, probably wanting to make money. Some of them fell away. One of them, who was very persistent, John Prescott, stayed on and founded the town, and we'll talk more about him when we get down to the old cemetery. But when you see the old cemetery down there, you're going to notice that it's rather a grim place. People tell me it's haunted. I don't believe it, but it is nonetheless a very grim place, and this stretches back to Old England, where most of the settlers came from. And of course we have this person. Anyone identify him for me?
Henry VIII.
Henry VIII, absolutely. Henry VIII was the founder of the Anglican Church. Anyone know what year? Yeah, 1534. Henry, the man who had 6 wives, was on his first wife, and he wanted an annulment. And at that time, I believe England was pretty much a Catholic country. So what did Henry VIII do? He requested an annulment. The Pope said no, so Henry said, enough of this, I'm going to break with the church. So they did break with the church, and for the years after that, in doctrine, the Church of England was heavily influenced by John Calvin, Protestant reformer. And then the actual organization and the rituals of the church remained Catholic. So there's a conflict for the people who are in England during this time when they were coming over to settle the New World. And the people who came here to settle in Lancaster, Massachusetts, were of the opinion, as the Puritans were, that the church should be purified from within. They didn't want to necessarily disown their church, but they wanted to see a lot of changes within. And so Calvinistic doctrine was high on their list. This is the way you're supposed to do things. Some of the early beliefs of the Puritans: they believed in God and salvation. God was a strict and awesome father. God's providence, as the Puritans understood it, meant that God controlled everything and everyone in the universe, and he could foresee everything that was to be. They believed that mortality was punishment for the original sin committed by Adam and Eve in the garden, and that most people were depraved and undeserving of salvation, which was a gift from God and bestowed only upon the very few. So they believed in predestination. God knows all. He knows all that's happened, will happen in the future, and is now. Everything's a manifestation of his will. Everything, including salvation and damnation, are already preordained, and yet God, let's see. No, I'm going to skip that part. Okay. Anyway, there are some who are considered to be the very elect. Now, you don't know if you're one of the elect or not, and you're living your whole life with this pressure to try to make it, to do good works, and to be good enough to make it so that when you rise up from your grave, and if you notice, these graves are all oriented to the east. The headstone is like the headboard of your bed. Your head's there. If it had a footstone, which many of them do, here and in the old cemetery, when you rise up out of your bed on the day when the Lord returns, if you're one of the elect, you'll rise up to meet him. And that's why you're facing east, because he is to come in the east. So those are the elect. And then for the others who are not the elect, those who are not destined to be saved, according to the Puritans, would suffer eternal damnation in hell after death, or after God's judgment on doomsday, whichever came first. They believe that because God bestowed salvation on a very few, most souls would face eternal torment in hell, which they believed was full of the worst horrors. And so, when we go down there and look at our artworks, and I consider them works of art, we didn't really have sculptors, but we did have wood carvers, which are the precursors of later sculptors here, you're going to see some of that fearsomeness of death reflected in the actual tympanums, which are the top portion of the headstones. You'll see the reflection. Some of the faces are happy, some of them are pretty grim. So when you go down there, you can take a look and see what they are. So anyway, what I want to do now is go on down there. We'll take a walk. I want to say, everybody, please watch your step. The ground is uneven. And when we get to the place where we're going to descend into the lower part of the cemetery there, you've really got to watch your step because there's crushed rock going down. So kind of hand over hand, help one another get down there safely. Okay, so Howie, my gravestone cleaner in chief here, can you point the way with
your... You want to show me my wound?
No, 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 no.
Where you pushed me?
Yeah, no, no. Show them the opening way there, Howie,
okay,
please.
The best way is through over there.
It's the easiest way. There's the other side where the trees were cut a couple years ago. That's a rough walk right now. I brought up the fact Lancaster was settled in 1642, thereabouts. It took them 10 years before they became incorporated, and 1653. Then it took a couple years later to get a church with a settled minister, the first one, of course, being Joseph Rowlandson. So at that time, in the earliest days of settlement, if you died, you got buried in the backyard, or you got buried in the apple orchard or some private place. After 1653, the burial ground was probably set aside. The meeting house was up on the hill in the cemetery that we just left, and then maybe an unmarked grave, because with their strictness with that Puritan belief, they didn't want any images or any extra notice of who the people were. Necessarily. It was very spare and very bare. So later the graves were located within a churchyard close to a church, and then here after the massacre we begin to see signs of stones going up after the resettlement of Lancaster. The first stone, the earliest stone in this cemetery that has any date on it is 1674. Dorothy Prescott. Other than that, the others are just we have no knowledge of who's here. So there are probably a lot of people buried here that we don't know about. And of course, during the massacre, they were probably all buried in a mass grave because there were several casualties. And it was probably somewhere in this area because the Rowlandson garrison was right across the street. But we don't know those things for sure. So this cemetery's the earliest use was probably 1656. The oldest stone marked with a death date is 1851. In this cemetery we have 196 stones and approximately 230 burials. Now there are family groups here, you'll notice as you go through, but there are no formal family plots laid out. It's kind of a loose arrangement as it was in those days. Okay. The earliest markers, and when you go through, you can see there were fieldstone markers, probably chiseled with a blacksmith's chisel, and they would have the name of the deceased chiseled in, and probably starting on the headstone with the vital information. And if there wasn't enough room on the headstone, they would simply carry on the text onto the footstone as well, till they had the few words about the person on it. Stones are tablets. That means the upright in the ground. Probably a third of that stone length is underground. They have long teeth that go down into the ground. Most of them are slate. Slate was a readily available material. It's pretty easy to shape and mold with proper tools. So let's see. The only problem with the slate from this point of view today is the fact that it's like a shale and it's kind of a laminated structure. So when you go through, you're going to notice that a lot of the tombstones are kind of splitting. There's not much we can do about that. It has to do with the quality of the slate. Lancaster did have a slate quarry up in the Fort Devens area, off limits to us today. There is also a slate quarry in Harvard, so it was a readily available material. Let's see, carvers. My sister here has some of the carvers. If you go through and you are really into the art and the carving of the whole thing, hold some of them up. Yeah.
We'll pass it out.
Yeah. In the earliest carvings, you have what we call a death head. Now, the death head is simply a skull, and the skull will probably have some teeth, upper and lower, in kind of a grinning position, and it'll probably have wings on it. And it's kind of a fearsome reminder that death is always around the corner. It's always coming, and you don't know when. As time went on, and the beliefs of the Puritans loosened up a bit, and people were not under the thumb of the Puritan religion as much, the stones changed, and you're going to see a design that looks a little bit different and more friendly. Instead of that fierce, grinning skull, forbidding skull, you're going to see a face. It's going to look more like a human face. The wings are going to be a little bit more beautifully defined, and you're going to see an angelic look about some of them. So that is what we call the soul effigy. The soul ascends to the Lord. You're between two worlds. You're between the earthly world and the heavenly world, heavenly place. So you've got the winged death heads, the winged soul effigy, and the third primary carving that you're going to see is the urn and the willow. Now that came about a bit later. There are 10 examples of that in this cemetery. But it's not as common down here. And the willow tree is a symbol of mourning, and of course an urn is for holding the ashes. And most of the stones up in the other cemetery, the middle cemetery, have that type of motif on them. The notables, who are the famous people that are buried in here? Anyone have any ideas?
Prescott.
Prescott, yes, the founder of Lancaster. We'll go down and visit his grave. We have 4 of the first 5 ministers buried here. Joseph Rowlandson went to Connecticut after the massacre. He's buried down there. He only lived about a year or so after the massacre. But we have John Whiting, Andrew Gardner, John Prentice, and Timothy Harrington. John Whiting was the minister after the resettlement, only for about 7 years. He was out in the field working one day. The Indians were lurking around. They confronted him, and he chose to go down fighting rather than be captured. He was immediately killed and scalped. Yeah, so that's John Whiting. He does have a stone here. Andrew Gardner, there was a little gap between the ministers there. 1701 to 1704, we had Andrew Gardner. He was the next minister. The Indians were still lurking about in 1704. They had the garrisons, one of the garrisons was fortified, and they had night sentries on duty. Unfortunately, there was a mistake because someone was a little too sleepy or didn't pay enough attention. One of the sentries, Mr. Gardner, had gone down on the main ground to look around, and one of the sentries mistook him for an Indian. The sentry called out, "Who goes there?" Didn't get any response. Called out, "Who goes there?" Didn't get any response. So what did the sentry do? He shot him. Yeah. Okay, so immediately they took him in, and he had regained consciousness to some extent, and he asked, "Who did this?" And they said, well, unfortunately, I think his name was Samuel Prescott, one of Prescott's, and he found out who his attacker had been, who shot him, and he said, well, let him know I forgive him. Okay, so then he passed away in the early morning hours, but the person who shot him never got over what he had done. He left town and probably carried the memory of what he had done throughout the rest of his life, and I believe he went to live in Concord, Massachusetts. So that was our second minister. So they had short durations. Next one that came 4 years later, 1708, stayed for 48 years. His name was John Prentice. He married the widow of the previous man who had been shot. And he has many family members buried here in a row, a lot of children. He had a brother who was a Dr. Prentice. So that was our minister who lasted 48 years. And then Timothy Harrington came after him. He was the minister that was here during the Revolutionary War. And he also has a large memorial stone. Other people that are buried here, famous. Families, the first families, people come back here all the time. This summer I got absolutely bombed with people who are coming. I think it's Ancestry.com that's done it. But they come back and they want to find out where their ancestors are, and they want tours. So it's become quite a tourist destination here for the oldest names like Prescott, Sawyer, Carter, Joslin, Houghton, Rugg, R-U-G-G, all those old names.
Are any of the Rollins buried here?
No.
They all go to Connecticut.
Yeah, they all, went to Connecticut, yeah.
Because
Oh, hi, Martha. How you doing?
Yeah, some of her children, one of her daughters was wounded, died a few days later, and she's buried out in Braintree. Yeah, and then the others were taken captive but redeemed, but they didn't come back here to live. Yeah, we have 3 veterans of the French and Indian Wars, and I'm sorry I can't tell you their names, but they're here. 4 veterans of the Revolutionary War are buried in this cemetery. And also at the very, very end, where those 2 folks are standing there, beyond the overgrown yew trees, the family burial place for the Thayer family, who were the people who were our wealthy benefactors in town. In 1937, they decided they would like to have a part in this burial ground as well. So they're buried, about 7 members are buried there beyond the yew trees. And yeah.
I know that the Thayers have a cemetery behind the house that they own.
Yes, they do.
So is this family members from the same family that are buried out here?
Okay, it's the Lancaster. There are tons of Thayers all over Massachusetts. They came over and they landed on the South Shore, as far as I can tell. So there are South Shore Thayers, and there's also a Lancaster branch of Thayers. And they started with minister number 6 of the Bullfinch Unitarian First Church. And he was the father of that family, and then he had a couple sons who made fortunes.
Yeah.
They had sons, they all built their homes, and they loved to be buried here. So they're buried here. They're buried in a private burial ground up on George Hill. They're buried in the North Village Cemetery as well.
And up front here, Heather.
Yeah, yeah.
Up in the front, there's a big.
Yeah, and here too. The Reverend Thayer, we'll get to that, yeah, is buried there as well. Yeah, so there's an extension lot that goes back to 1937 back there. Okay, memorial stones. In addition to the regular stones that went in for family members on an as-needed basis, we also have 5 or 4 memorial stones. One is in the back. It's the Prescott Memorial Stone that was put in years later by descendants of the Prescott family in honor of John Prescott, the founder of Lancaster. And there's a nice writing on that stone. And then also we have the Houghton Memorial Stone. Some of you are standing right near it there. He was our early clerk, town leader, got an extra grant of land that was from the Leominster area, from one of the Indians, and the deed is written on the back of the stone. Okay, another memorial stone right here. This one was put in 1907 by descendants of the White family. The White family went all over the United States afterwards. They spread abroad, but they'd come back here and have reunions every year. And we have pictures of them standing in the cemetery, standing in the Rollinson Garrison area. And so this is for John White, who was from Wenham. They landed on the North Shore. He lived until just about a year before the massacre. Unfortunately, his wife Joanne died a year after they moved here. So she died about 1654. But this is a later stone, 1907. And then there is a Reverend A. Gardner. Reverend Gardner was the one who was shot by mistake, by friendly fire. And there's a polished slate tablet marker that was put in 1878 because his original stone was destroyed, or it just fell apart. So that is the story on that. So, if you want to take a few minutes and wander around and take a look, I'd love to have you do that. So you're now in the Middle Cemetery. The Middle Cemetery is the third oldest cemetery. That was the first. This is the third. Second oldest cemetery was on the Old Common near the Five Corners, now Four Corners. They moved the center of the town there because the two meeting houses that were up there were burned by the Indians, second time in 1704. The population said, we're not going to put up with getting another meeting house burned. Let's move east of the river. We have a better chance of escaping. So they moved the center of the town east of the river up to the Old Common. And if you drive up Old Common Road, on the left-hand side is the Churchyard Cemetery. On the other side, in somebody's front yard, there's a marker that's sunk down quite a ways into the ground, but that was the third meeting house. And so that's the story on that. So that's the second one. Yes, that was the area that was called Bride Cake Plain. The second generation or more after the first generation lived up there. And it was a community, it was a center of town for a long while up there in the Old Common. Okay, this cemetery, size 1.5 acres, period of use. First burials, 1798. And the cemetery was then enlarged in 1843. If you look around, you'll see the last person buried in here was buried in here in 1989. She was over 100 years old. Number of stones, 1,000 stones approximately. Number of burials, about 1,200 burials in here. This is a cemetery, not a graveyard. What's the difference?
Is a graveyard attached to a church?
Yes, good. Graveyards attached to a church within the graveyards within the churchyard. A cemetery is a more secular place, not necessarily attached to a church location, and for people who may not necessarily be members of the church so much to be buried. So this is a secular, more secular location. And so cemetery comes from the French word cimetière, which comes from the Greek, which means sleeping place. Okay. You're going to see different kinds of monuments in this cemetery. After the War of 1812, commemorative monuments came into more and more prevalence. So you're going to see things that are commemorating. Back in the old days, in the Puritan days, you didn't say nice things about anyone. They just simply died and that was it. But here, you memorialize people, you remember them, you point out their good deeds and their valor and their patriotism if they were war heroes. So you're going to see the obelisks and the different upright kind of structures. Let's see. The primary motif in this cemetery, you're not going to see any death heads. to speak of, maybe one or two. You're not going to see the soul effigy, which is a face attached to the wings. You're going to see the urn and the willow. And there's about 300 rectangular shouldered, not round shouldered, but rectangular shouldered stones that have the willow and urn motif. Other motifs you'll see here, because this is Victorian times now more. 1837, Victoria went on the throne. For the entire 19th century, the Victorians had their say. They were much more sentimental, and they memorialized people a lot more. So you see roses and broken flower buds, lambs for children. You'll see a dove, perhaps, with the head downward, the wings pointing to heaven. You might see a finger pointing straight up to heaven. Yonder is my home. There's one right over there. Two hands clasped in a handshake. Your earthly welcome, heavenly welcome, earthly farewell. You might see a sheaf of wheat carved into the stone. What might the sheaf mean? Sheaf of wheat? Okay, a sheaf of wheat harvested at or after the ripe age of 70 years old. You are mature. So you are harvested at 70 at maturity. Gee, I hope that isn't the last word. That would be horrible. Then you're going to have other religious symbols. Three-leaf plant means a Holy Trinity. Shiro, first and second letters of Christ's Greek name in Greek. IHS, three letters of Jesus' name in Greek. Robed arms outstretched holding crosses with your fingers pointing extended. That type of thing. In this cemetery, you're going to see, too, a lot more marble. Did you see any marble down below? No, just mostly the slate. And maybe a little bit of granite or fieldstone. Up here, marble became the stone of choice during the Victorian era. Marble was originally quarried in Dorset, Vermont, as early as 1785. So it was being so beautiful and white and gorgeous and could be easily cut into. People used that as their stone of choice. And it is a fairly heavy stone. Unfortunately, it has a few drawbacks. It absorbs a lot of acid rain. And these stones in this cemetery show that result. For years and years, this acid rain had come down and the stones are terribly discolored. We do have my stone cleaner, however, who has done, he has a product that was approved by our DPW superintendent, Kevin Bartlett, and he has been spraying the stone. It's not a fast process. It takes a long time to see results. But you can see the results on a couple stones that are over that way. And bear in mind, we did do this with permission. You don't want to ever go in and just start doing things on your own. No, don't. Yeah, so that's ironic, though, because these people would pay all this money for those marble stones, and the messages that they'd have on are just like completely worn away in a lot of cases. You can't read the words. It's very difficult to read the words. Then you have granite, and granite is a very, very hard stone, and it's not necessarily what I'd call carved. It's more like chipped away. So that is used frequently in this cemetery as well. We have some carvers that are represented here, but it's not as interesting to me as the ones down there with all the variations on the heads. You've got the, what they would do is sign their initials in the bottom corner of the stone, and that's how you can identify them. And so there are 5 of them, which I have listed. And then we have obelisks, pedestals with urns. We have one tomb. Our 6th minister, Nathaniel Thayer, is buried in our only tomb up on the main street. He died in 1840. We believe his wife is in there as well. Her life lasted 17 years beyond his. So we do believe that both of them are in that tomb, but that's the only tomb in the entire cemetery. There's another feature in this cemetery in Victorian times in the first half of the 1800s. For example, if you go to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, you would see all of these wrought iron fences in rectangular shapes around the family plots, because now you can plan ahead for your burials. So you have a pedestal in the middle, and you have spaces around the edge to put your family. And then you enclose it with the beautiful wrought iron gate. In Mount Auburn, they have probably 50 left. At one time, they had 300. Here we have one. If you walk over there, it's quite elaborate, but it's on its way out. So enjoy it while you can, because it may not be there in a few more years. In the second half of the 1900s, the curbing, the granite curbing, came into vogue. And so you see, especially on this third of the cemetery, there's a lot of granite curbing here, and that was the style of the times. Okay.
And that was when?
When?
When? The curbing?
Oh, the second half of the 1800s. Yeah, and even more into today. You know, it's more popular now. Okay, there's only one commemorative marker. It was put in 1925 by the DAR chapter of the Mary Washington group over in Clinton, Daughters of the American Revolution. They put up the marker. It's over at the top of the hill where the meeting houses most likely stood, and that marks the place. And as I said before, if all the trees were cut, if this were all clear-cut land, from where the meeting house was, you could see all the houses,
Wow.
all the settlers' houses all the way around. That was the epicenter of the town,
Wow.
right there. So anyway, let's see. Notables. Later generations of Lancastrians. You're going to see those names again. The Sawyers, the Houghtons, the Carters, galore. Wilders, everybody. You're going to see Nathaniel Thayer. I mentioned him, the minister. 37 veterans of the Revolutionary War. There's a section over there where you're going to see the flags. The flags mark the graves of the Revolutionary War soldiers. There's one Revolutionary War soldier. They all have their stories, but there's just one that I'll mention here today. You may see his pedestal marker. His name was Eli Stearns. He was born in Rutland but died in Lancaster, 1825. He married here in Lancaster. And he had been apprenticed to a man in Princeton and was sent by his master to serve in the Revolution. If you were a master, you could send your slave or your worker to take your place in the service. So Eli was shot through the head, a ball entering his left cheek and passing out under the right ear. But he recovered from the wound. He became an assistant commissary and continued service until his discharge in 1783. And here in town, he was a justice of the peace and a representative, so he was a town leader. And if that's his story, I can only imagine what some of the other stories might have been too, if they had talked about it, and I don't believe they probably did, or if they did, it was not recorded, because they had some real good stories of their experience in the war. So we've got one veteran of the War of 1812. I haven't sought him out yet. We have 14 veterans from the Civil War, including Lancaster historian Henry Stedman Nurse. His family plot is up on the corner near the road. He would correct the other historian, whose name is Marvin, who wrote the history of Lancaster. Nurse was very exacting with his details, and he wrote a complete annotated version of the other man's history book. And that can be found in the library, the Thayer Library, and it can be found online as well. So that's a great resource.
Isn't it like 17 volumes?
Yes, it's huge.
And the Marvin
Yeah.
one is like this?
Yeah, Marvin's about 550 pages, and the other one must be thousands.
And Marvin's big enough because people come and take, we both work at the library.
Yes.
They come and take Marvin out all the time.
Yeah.
Everybody's looking for it.
And Marvin's good, but he has made some errors. And once an error gets in print, you know how hard it is to undo that mistake. So, but that's just the way it is. And okay, so we have Professor William Russell and his family. He had come to Lancaster mid-1800s, and his family are buried over there. He was known for starting normal schools. A normal school, if you see normal in the name of the school, it's for teacher training. So that was his claim to fame. We have a man named David Poignand and his wife Delicia Poignand, and with Mr. Plant, who was a son-in-law. They were the first ones to manufacture fabrics by power looms in Worcester County. And you know how there's this debate about who did the first power looms in the new country? and the people down at Slater Mills in Rhode Island claim it, and the people in Lowell claim it, and Lawrence probably had something to do with it. Well, Lancaster very well may have been on that early level of development, but Henry Nurse wouldn't say for sure. He just said one of the earliest. So they're buried here too. And then we have, where are they? The Symes. Somebody, where did I see this?
Yeah.
The Symes. Okay, you see those rubble stones? We call it rubble stone. Okay, and then it has kind of the granite scroll work on the front polished. Okay, that's Caleb Symes and his wife Nancy. And there may be a child or two buried in there with the family. And they were attempted murder victims.
Ooh.
And so I thought I'd mention them too, because everybody does have a story to tell. And the story was that he worked in the bank, and there was an immigrant who came from Germany, and he lived in with the family, and he got to know them quite well. And Mr. Symes would take home the key for the bank at the end of the day and kept it in a secret place in his home. Well, this was known to this German immigrant, so he kept waiting for an opportunity to be able to overtake them, like when they're asleep in bed. So one night, you know, they hear this noise, and I'm not sure I have all the details right, but you can read the story because it's available in the newspaper, the Worcester Telegram. So he snuck into the room, and he cut the man's throat, but apparently not mortally. He started to bleed. And then he cut the woman's throat, and she started to scream, and the screams, I think, brought in help from somewhere else, and the German immigrant who had perpetrated the crime left. But Mr. Symes, previous to the perpetrator leaving, said, look, if you leave the country and if you spare my wife's life, and you leave the country and never come back, I will not testify against you. So the man agreed to not testifying against him. So but the German immigrant was tracked down and was put in jail. But Mr. Symes wouldn't testify against him. Anyway, he finally left the country.
What's the German's name? Hitler?
No, I don't know who it was. But,
Was the bank in Lancaster?
there was a bank in Lancaster at one time. Moved over to Clinton later on. And I may not have all the details straight because I only read that one time. But I can make it available to you if you're interested in the details.
Now,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, isn't one of the fire stations a former bank building?
Yes.
The little
And
one?
the one where the Woods ambulance is across
Yeah.
from the town
Was
green.
that where that bank was?
Yeah, that's where the Lancaster Bank was. Yes. So anyway, those are the murder victims. They recovered. I understand that his wife predeceased him, and in his later years, Mr. Symes had a caretaker, and he was said to have gone crazy. So he needed a caretaker. He was not in his right mind. But it does make an interesting story. So we've got all kinds of people with stories to tell in this cemetery, that is for sure, and ones I probably don't even know about. And as you wander through, there was one man that I hoped would be a Revolutionary War hero because he looked like he was in the right time frame. He was a captain. And you'll see his stone over there. And I thought, you know, you can wander around. I'll be happy to answer questions, but I wanted to close with what it said on his stone. It says, across the tympanum, it says, an honest man's the noblest work of God. Then it has his name, Captain Ephraim Carter. He died, he's one of the first burials, died May 19, 1798, when he was aged 55. This is the commemorative message on his stone. He was a comfort and staff to aged parents, a guide to children, a faithful and affectionate consort, a patron and lover of Freemasonry, and a constant benefactor to the poor. He was animated with public spirit. He promoted the good of society, and in his numerous private and public employments acted with strict integrity. He was a sincere Christian, and his memory shall long be cherished. And I think that's a wonderful thing to be able to say about someone. And I hope all of us Lancastrians who someday may have to find a resting place in a similar setting, I hope somebody can say that about all of us. So anyway, if you have questions, feel free to ask. I don't know. He was only 55.
People
So,
died
Yeah. I'm not sure what his cause of death was. So I want to thank you for coming. If you have questions, please ask. Yes.
My question is, if God forbid I drop dead tomorrow, where are they going to bury me in Lancaster today? Is it the one where the
Eastwood.
Is that the one where the Memorial Day parade ends up?
No.
Oh.
You can get buried there if your family has pre-purchased a lot. The place to get buried is in Eastwood Cemetery, which is up the old Common Road. And that cemetery has a beautiful story too. We had a landscape architect create that cemetery.
I don't even know. I've probably been by there, not even.
Yeah, and that's a large cemetery, but I'm going to save that for one of my future stories.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, but it's a good one. Yes.
Do you have any more information or history about the stones? I think you called it rubble stone over here with the scrolls.
We
because
can
it's
research
such an
it.
unusual
Yeah,
style.
it's I don't have any right now. We could find out what the history of it is. It's a hard stone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a little bit more interesting than some of the others.
It is.